Yeah, okay, so I can still only go. So once we get this on YouTube, I'm gonna I'll put the link in the chat window as well, Rebecca, if you wanted to put that on. All right, there we are. We are. Yeah, okay, so I can still only go. Once we get this on YouTube, let me unmute that. All right. Okay. There's the link, Rebecca, if you want to share that. Let me put this on our. This is where I understand why people have like a technical assistant running this when they do things like this. Okay. Now I'm going to share it. All right. Rebecca, are you ready? If you wanted to share it?
I'm working on sharing it right now.
Okay. All right. Looks like we got some folks tuning in. So why don't we go ahead and maybe get started. And Rebecca will have that link shared in just a moment. So thank you all for joining us tonight for this webinar discussion that's titled Light in the Darkness, discussion about abuse in our community. And so really glad to be joined by members of the Treehouse Child Advocacy Center, who I'll introduce in just a moment, as well as GRACE, which stands for Godly Response to Abuse in a Christian Environment. I'll be introducing GRACE as well in just a moment. And so I just wanted to take a minute as we're getting started. My name is Ben. I'm with Shady Grove Presbyterian Church. I just wanted to introduce this conversation and kind of how we got to having this conversation tonight. I've known about Treehouse for a couple of years, and I first learned about Treehouse actually through True Respite Brewery, which is just across the parking lot from you all, I'm good friends with the co-owners there, Brendan and Bailey O'Leary, and I know that they have a real heart for the Treehouse and have tried to do some things over the last couple of years with you all. And so a little shout out to them. They're right across the parking lot from Treehouse and the work that they do. So grateful for them introducing me to Treehouse. But I learned about Treehouse around the same time that our church had actually started partnering with this organization, GRACE, which stands for Godly Response to Abuse in a Christian Environment. And Mike is here and he's going to talk a little bit more about GRACE. But GRACE has helped our church over the last couple of years think more about what it means to be aware and potentially help prevent abuse from happening, but then also how do we respond, report, and how can we as a church in any way care for victims when they might come forward in our environment. So we're trying to make it a safe place to talk about and report abuse in our church. And so as we've been working with GRACE, it just really, I had hoped for so long to get to a point where we would also be able to work with Treehouse in some capacity. And so that's kind of how we got to this conversation. So this conversation was also born out of, we're doing a fundraiser right now to try and help benefit the Treehouse at the church. And so this idea just kind of stemmed as like a kind of go along with the fundraiser and try and link up these two organizations, GRACE and Treehouse, to have this conversation. And so that's kind of how we got here. And so I was really glad we can have this conversation, really glad we have so many members of the Treehouse here with us. And one thing I'll say before we introduce Treehouse staff here and introduce GRACE, obviously I'm with the church. I'm one of the pastors at Shady Grove Presbyterian Church in Durwood. Mike is from GRACE, which is a religious organization. I just want to make clear from the beginning that the Treehouse is not a religious organization. The Treehouse works with any kid in need in the county, any family in need in the county. Just so happens that this conversation is being hosted by a church. And so for those of you who tuning in, I don't want anyone to get the idea that the Treehouse is, partisan or, part of a religious group or anything like that. That's not the case, but we're just really grateful that Treehouse has joined us for this conversation where we're going to kind of talk a little bit about the community at large, and then also a little bit about religious church dynamics as well with Grace here. So that being said, why don't we go ahead and introduce everyone here on the call. And so let's start introducing the staff from Treehouse. And so I was hoping to start with Tom Grazio. He's the executive director at the Treehouse. And so I was hoping you could maybe tell us, Tom, about the Treehouse, the work the Treehouse does, and then a little bit about your role there, and then we'll go through, introduce the other staff members as well.
Yes, in a sentence, thank you, by the way, for this opportunity.
Yeah.
In a sentence, the mission of the Treehouse is to offer hope and healing to victims of abuse. The lion's share of the children we work with are victims of childhood sex abuse, but I'm very fortunate to have a great team, and we get referrals from the investigating authorities for all kinds of child abuse, physical, gross physical neglect, and sex abuse. When they come to the Treehouse, we are focused on the child. We're not worried about whether or not there's going to be a conviction. We're not worried about whether or not the child's going to be removed. We want the experience for the child to be the beginning of the path to overcoming their trauma. And I have a great team of people who get to talk, who do that. I would like to speak briefly about our transitional trauma program, of which Sarah and Linda, who you'll see on this screen, are a part of. We began several years ago to work with kids who were entering foster care. Because if you think about it, a child who's abused has already experienced trauma, and their secondary trauma, or their second trauma, is they're taken out of their home and put in a strange place. So these young professionals are working with kids who have the need to be assessed as well as helped in understanding what's going on and understanding that it's not their fault. So I think everything we do is about kids, and I'm very proud to be a part of it. And my role is basically to keep the lights on. I mean, I'm supposed to create the right environment for children to be able to recover, and they do the rest. So I'll be quiet now and let somebody else on the team speak up.
Thank you, Tom. Why don't we then go to, I'll introduce Dr. Evelyn Shukat, who's the medical director at Treehouse. So Dr. Evelyn, could you maybe tell us a little bit about the work that you do at the Treehouse?
Absolutely. And thank you, Ben, for this opportunity. It's wonderful. I'm just part of the medical team. My partner is Andrea Coleman, who's the pediatric registered nurse. And between the both of us, we have the goal of treating and listening to children who have been abused and neglected, and evaluating them in a holistic way, and not so much focus as to the bruises or if they've been sexually abused, but taking the child in their entirety as to what their medical needs are, and listening to them, as well as examining them and being sure that we're going to do preventive measures for them medically. Children who are abused or go into foster care are the most underserved population out of all kids, and they don't have an opportunity always to be heard. So that's our job, and we are just part of the process. We work with our team members in mental health. We have a forensic interviewer, and as Tom said, with a lot of other agencies, it takes a great deal of coordination to protect children. And it's just not the report of knowing that a child's abused. It's really what happens to it. We can't go back and stop the abuse that's happened, but I think everybody at the Treehouse, medically, mental health wise, et cetera, are dedicated to being sure that that child has a positive life as much as possible afterwards. So that's what Andrea and I do.
That's great. Thank you so much. That's just such a, I can't imagine, hard, but also so important role and job. So thank you. Next, we'll introduce Dr. Renee DeBoard-Lucas, mental health therapist at the Treehouse. So could you tell us a little bit about what you do at the Treehouse?
Sure, happy to. So one of the pieces, we are a child advocacy center, like you mentioned, and one of the things that's really cool about what we do is that we're kind of a one-stop shop. So kids don't have to tell their story over and over and over. So they don't have to tell the police and then tell the medical doctor and then tell the therapist, right? Tell the social worker. They get to do it one time. And so that's part of reducing their trauma. So Tom mentioned the abuse is the first, maybe getting removed is the second, and telling everyone 100 times, maybe as a third. So I am one of the clinicians there, and I do therapy with children and families who've experienced abuse. We do what's called research supported treatment. So there have been, lots of studies to tell us that the work that we do is really effective. It's called trauma-focused CBT, if anybody wants the technical term. And really what that means is we talk about the stuff that happened, and that can sound like a hard thing to do. And why would you do that? But we just not talk about it. But, if you fall and scrape your knee, it hurts to clean out the wound. But if you don't, it doesn't heal very well. And that's the same sort of reason that we talk about these hard things. And we're equipping kids and families with the tools to cope. So a really cool part of the treatment that we do is not only giving the kids the tools, but giving the parents the tools so they can support their children in coping most effectively. And this is a trauma for the whole family. And so the parents can also use those tools to cope themselves. And another piece is I'm involved in some of the training at the Treehouse. So we have a training program, and we're training, future generations of clinicians to help more kids.
Great. Real quick, just this could have been any of you, but what primarily is the age range that the Treehouse works with when we're talking about children? Is that up to a certain age, or?
I believe it's up to 18, but I think Tom can correct me if that's wrong.
That is correct.
That's correct. Okay. And I believe, we start relatively young, sometimes 3 to 4, because there are other treatments that we can do that is really more primarily with the caregivers that help a child who at that age is maybe not going to verbalize as much or talk as much about their trauma, but they still act out in ways that we know that things are not quite right. So they can help the caregivers.
The medical team serves a lot of babies. I'm sorry to interrupt, but
oh, okay, good.
We do have very young kids, sadly, in Montgomery County who are seriously abused. And our medical team is involved in all that.
We see children, I was just going to say, thank you, Tom. We've seen children a few days old, all the way up until their 18th birthday. Seeing them for foster screening exams, or if they've been hurt in some way. So it is pretty sad. Clearly, infants can't talk and engage in therapy. So, but they can show other things in the way they react and what their body shows. So that's what we do to help and protect them.
Yeah. Well, as a father of a 2.5-year-old and a 3-month-old, that's just,
there you go.
I mean, especially heartbreaking to hear that for me. Well, let's introduce Rebecca Dessalines, who's the Community Outreach Coordinator. So Rebecca, why don't you tell us a little bit about the work that you do at the Treehouse?
Yes. And thank you again, Ben, for organizing this and having the Treehouse here and for this opportunity. So I'm the Community Outreach Coordinator. I do a lot of the behind the scenes work like Tom. I handle the fundraising and social media aspect for the Treehouse and partnering with local communities and organizations to pair with the assistance of raising funds. So similar to working with you all at Shady Grove Presbyterian Church, that's a lot of what I do is community outreach and going out into the community and spreading awareness on what the Treehouse is and the services that we provide.
Okay, great, thank you. Next up, and I think this is going to be, well, I skipped. Oh, I'm sorry. I skipped Andrea. You were on the list above Rebecca, and I'm sorry. I was looking. I was like, we still have more names. Okay, so let me go back. Introduce Andrea Coleman, who's a pediatric nurse. And Andrea, could you tell us about the work that you do at the
Yes,
Treehouse?
yes. Thank you so much. I guess I want to mirror the comments that other people said about, thank you so much for acknowledging that we have an issue with abuse. And a lot of people want to say, not in my backyard. Well, yes, it's probably your back, your front, and your side door. So I really appreciate you giving us the opportunity and partnering with us to help these children. So like my twin said, she did not announce that we are twins. Dr. Shukat and I are split from one unit. That's
right.
how closely we work together. And all of the children know we are twins. So she explained what we do, but I know that we've all said that it's painful what these children have gone through. But I will tell you that it is a very rewarding experience to work with them. They are so resilient, and when given the opportunity and resources, children really do heal well.
Thank you, Andrea. It looks like we lost Tom. Hopefully he can come back and join us. I'm hoping that having a live stream doesn't prevent people from coming in, while it's, but we'll see. We'll see if he joins us. Hopefully he comes back. But last two individuals I'm going to introduce here from the Treehouse. Both of you, I believe, work as transitional trauma therapists, right, in the same role. But let's introduce Linda Kim first. If you could tell us a little bit about your role at the Treehouse, and we'll hear from Sarah Abbott.
Sure. Yes, and thank you, as everyone's been saying, for just holding this. As a transitional trauma therapist, we receive petitions for all children who are placed in foster care. And the goal of, working with them and supporting the kinship care families and the foster families is helping the children to process the removal from the home, providing psychoeducation to the foster families and to the children about trauma and also the impact of removal, as well as some child development. We engage them in building some communication between caregiver and child, because we know that it has such a big impact on long-term healing, having that positive caregiver relationship and attachment forming. And we work on assessing the safety of the children in the environment where they've been placed, as well as if they have any kind of suicidal or homicidal ideation. And as some of the other staff had mentioned, we serve children all the way from infant up to 18 years old. And so the therapy service looks, quite a bit different for the infants placed in the home from the older children. But all of it is providing support to, reduce the need for placements being moved from place to place, and also just to enhance that overall attachment and relationship with the children who are being placed in the home, so that they can have more stability as they transition into foster care.
That's great. Thank you, Linda. And last, we'll hear Sarah Abbott. Could you just tell us a little bit about, if you want to add anything to that Linda just said about your role at the Treehouse?
Sure. Again, my name is Sarah Abbott, and I am a transitional trauma therapist. I think Linda pretty much covered it all. But again, our biggest goal, or one of our biggest goals, is to reduce the amount of times a kid has to move from home to home, because we know that's very traumatic for kids. And like she said, we've treated kids from birth to 18, which is a little different than other mental health programs we have in the Treehouse. So ours covers a bigger range of ages, I think. But I think you covered it well, Linda.
Thanks, Sarah. And for those who don't know, Sarah is a member at our church, Shady Grove. And I just was so thrilled when I found out, Sarah, that you were working at the Treehouse, and now getting to meet the rest of your team. Like, I'm just so encouraged that you are surrounded by these amazing people in the work that you do. So this is great. Going to move to the next. I want to introduce Mike Sloan. Mike Sloan is with an organization known as GRACE, which is an acronym that stands for Godly Response to Abuse in a Christian Environment. Mike, you're the director of their Safeguarding Initiative program, which is something that our church has been going through. And so, Mike, could you tell us about GRACE, the work that you do, that GRACE does, and then specifically maybe about what you do with GRACE?
Sure. Thanks, Ben. So at GRACE, our mission is to empower Christian communities to recognize, prevent, and respond to abuse. We've been around since 2004. We're a national organization, so we've served hundreds of churches and other Christian organizations around the United States. We've done a little bit of work internationally as well. There are two major portions of the work that we do. About half the work we do is involving independent assessments and investigations. Now, just to be clear, our investigations would never interfere with a criminal investigation, but there are times where, let's say, statute of limitations has expired, or there's other circumstances where the behavior is concerning, but not necessarily criminal, where an organization needs investigation. We come in as an independent third party with expertise and find facts and present recommendations to the organizations so they can move forward, often in helping victims heal. And also, of course, sometimes there's a need to make personnel decisions with someone currently on staff. The other half of the work we do is under the umbrella of our Safeguarding Initiative, which you mentioned, and I'm the director of that. And that's more of our proactive prevention and response work we do with churches. So we wanted to bring a more comprehensive approach to help churches come out of denial and see the prevalence of abuse, not only in our communities, but in churches, and really make serious strides in addressing the issues of abuse with children, but also the many other forms of abuse that are prevalent in faith communities. So in that initiative, we give deeper training to various groups within the church. We have leadership training. We have training that's designed for all adults to engage them in understanding abuse on a deeper level and engage them in prevention and response. And of course, we have material that's appropriate for children. And then, of course, we work on policy development and other issues with churches. So part of that work is we really encourage churches to connect with local trauma-informed resources like local child advocacy centers like the Treehouse. We're never going to make serious progress in these issues until faith communities recognize the depth of these issues, begin to see and look around for others who have better understanding and training and trauma-informed approaches, and begin to work together on these issues. So thrilled to be here and thrilled to be a part of this with the Treehouse. So thanks, Ben.
Thank you, Mike. And just one more maybe question about GRACE. So GRACE has a full team, including some legal authorities and law enforcement or psychologists. What are kind of the range of staff at GRACE?
Sure. So here's the thing. When you start to address issues related to abuse, you recognize that immediately you're involving professionals in different fields. So you have mental health and trauma, and you have law enforcement, and you have legal questions and issues. And in faith communities, you have spiritual issues, and pastors are involved. So we have a whole range of people on our team. We have a multidisciplinary team, and we have to bring those different approaches and perspectives together if we're going to adequately put children first, always. And that's really our goal at GRACE. So much of what has been done in churches in terms of policy and prevention comes actually from a liability and a risk management perspective. It comes from insurance companies and lawyers. And it's not that that's a completely invalid perspective, but that perspective, by definition, is going to prioritize the institution first. And our perspective is that's a wrong approach. Is Christian organizations, any religious organization must put children first and an individual victim or a survivor first in any circumstances, whatever comes as a consequence to the organization itself, they have a responsibility and a duty to put children first, always.
Thank you, Mike. So we're going to move forward now and get into some more specific questions about abuse and prevention reporting. I'm a little bit worried we may have lost Dr. Shukat. It looks like her picture's frozen. And so I don't know if one of you can maybe get in touch with her to see if she's able to.
She's working on that right now.
Great.
She does not know what happened.
Okay. Well, hope she can come back. I don't know if I should, I don't know if it'd be helpful to kick her out or not, and then she'd be able to return back in, or I'll just leave her there for now.
Okay.
You can keep me updated.
Yeah, I'll keep you updated. I'll tell her to start over. Tom got back in, so I'm sure she can get back in.
Yeah, tell her to reboot Zoom and re-click the link, and hopefully that'll work for her. So let's keep moving though. And I wanted to, before we get into maybe some questions, I wanted to give us kind of a common, oh, got another share screen here. There we go. Wanted to kind of have a common definition of abuse and neglect. And so I was hoping someone from Treehouse could maybe just talk to us a little bit about what do we mean when we're talking about abuse and neglect, and then I'll ask Mike maybe to add on from a religious or spiritual abuse. But what do we mean when we're talking about abuse and neglect when you say that's the work that you do at the Treehouse?
Well, I am going to start to answer that, and others may pipe up if they have ideas. The first thing you need to know is that there is no common definition of child abuse and neglect. There are 50 states that have passed laws, and in 50 states, there are definitions of what constitutes child abuse. I am going to tell you in Maryland, it's okay to hit your children as long as you don't cause harm. Harm is defined by the courts in Maryland as leaving a mark. In Maryland, there's no such thing as emotional abuse, although the professionals in this field know that parents can traumatize children emotionally, and it can have lifelong effects. In more progressive states, the definition of child abuse does include emotional abuse. So we at the Treehouse work within Montgomery County and use the law because that's how the investigators open cases. If the case meets that threshold of the state's definition, we then will participate in what's going on. But we're not stupid. There are children who are victimized who don't come to the attention of authorities. And we try to create awareness in the community, and we try to connect people with resources. But to be perfectly candid, we work with the cases that are referred to us by the authorities, and they're using the state law to define child abuse and neglect. Anybody else have a thought about this topic?
I was going to mention that, like you said, even though corporal punishment is permissible by law in Maryland, when we're doing treatment, we're trying to help families understand that there are other ways to discipline children and to help support children's behavior when it's challenging. I think as far as neglect, we see kids that haven't been fed properly or given a safe place to live, or sometimes their medical needs haven't been tended to. But just to second what Tom said, even though there might not be by the law, emotional abuse, we definitely see kids who are really affected and carry kind of the lasting impact of emotional abuse.
I think that one thing that I want to point out about sexual abuse is that a lot of people may think, oh, it's touching a child or, having sex with a child, but it can be anything, even not touching a child, that someone gets sexual gratification from. So say they like watching the child bathe, or watching the child undress, watching the child, hug other children and do things like that. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they were hands-on for it to be classified as sexual abuse. And I think that's something that at times people miss.
I think that's really important. Thanks for highlighting that for us. Dr. Shukat, we were just talking about what do we mean when we're talking about abuse or neglect. And one thing Tom brought out is how every state has a different definition. So having to work within the bounds of the state and Montgomery County and all of that. Is there anything that you would maybe want to add in terms of a working definition of abuse?
Well, I do. But before that, it's good to note that in the state of Maryland, everybody is a mandated reporter. And I think people are afraid to report because they think they may get into trouble or there may be some legal recriminations from it, but it's not. When you pick up the phone, it's to report a conscious effort that's thought out that I think a child is in need of safety or is being abused. And that is your responsibility as a citizen of the state and the world to take care of children. And dovetailing on what Andrea was saying about sexual abuse per se, unfortunately, Andrea and I hear a lot of kids tell us that their parents didn't think that the sexual abuse was that bad. It may have been a little touching, even over clothes. But to that child, it's a total violation of their being. And it's the understanding of, from the child's point of view, that they're okay. We validate their health and well-being, and hopefully educate as well, parents and children, to know that, to tell them that no touching is okay, and that are on private parts or parts that are covered by a bathing suit in a young child or older child too. So there's no degree of what's okay for kids. It's no touching, and how they respond to it is pretty dramatic and very important to respect.
Yeah, I really appreciated what you said about bringing out the reporting there. And so I want to come back, I want to hear from Mike on spiritual abuse. So I want to come back to maybe some of the Treehouse staff and ask you all in a moment a little bit more about reporting. So I think that's really significant, what we were just talking about there. So before we get there though, maybe Mike, from your perspective, working with churches, how do you help them understand what abuse is? Maybe these different, sexual, emotional, physical abuse, but then clearly spiritual abuse as well. And I think we would say it often it's mixing, right? It's not just one, right? Especially in a religious context, if there's physical abuse, it's also spiritual abuse, probably, right, and so on. So yeah, Mike, anything to add there?
Just a couple things to add would be, so I mentioned we train in all 50 states. So we go into church.
Defreeze for everyone else too?
Yes.
Okay. Hopefully he comes back. Oh man. Give him a second. And if not, we'll go to that reporting question and we'll come back to Mike if he doesn't unfreeze. All right, let's hit reporting and we'll come back to Mike when he gets back. So Dr. Shukat, you had brought out just maybe even this idea of a fear of reporting, either of getting in trouble themselves or of getting someone else in trouble if they maybe don't want, what if I'm wrong, right? Maybe that would be a fear. So what would you all say to a parent or a teacher or just anyone who might be worried that abuse is going on? What would be your encouragement or your exhortation to them to take the step of reporting?
Well, I'd like Tom to join in too, but reporting is anonymous. The reporting source is not shared with the family of the abused child. So that's number one. And a lot of times when, physicians and nurses many times tell the parents that they're going to make a report, but also, I think more importantly, we frame it in a positive way Because most people, and I've been doing this for a while, here, I'm going to report your child, I think, to CPS, they equate it immediately, my child is going to be taken away from me. And that's not really the case. I mean, we're there to really help. CPS, Child Protective Services, there to assess the needs of a child and a family and the safety of the child in a positive way. Now, yes, there are times that children, no matter what safety plans are put in, aren't able to stay home. But that needs to be explained to parents and to the people who make the report, that you're not really harming the child, you're helping the child survive. About 1,100 children die every year due to child abuse. So that's about 3 a day, a little over 3 a day. That's pretty significant. That doesn't include the ones that are in hospitals and that have brain trauma or who are burned, or who are in psychiatric hospitals from suicidal attempts due to the repeated abuse. So that would be my word of advice. Tom, what do you say?
Of course, Evelyn is extremely knowledgeable. I do want to underscore one point. In Maryland, the person making the report is protected. It is the most important caveat in the way Child Protective Services operates. I can tell you this because I started my career as a Child Protective Service worker. You never disclose who made the report. So anybody who is concerned about a child should call in and express their concerns to the people who are tasked with helping, and feel comfortable that they will not be disclosed to any of the family members as the person who made the report.
Right. I think that in life, everyone knows that we have regrets in life. But it would be sad to regret not reporting something that you thought was happening to a child, and it ended up in tragedy. So it's best just to report. It's not your job to figure out what's going on. Let the professionals do that. But that's not a regret that I would want to have.
Yeah, and just to add to that, when we receive these petitions from child welfare, they are really thorough in examining the background. So if you're unsure of your own determination, feeling the way of if this child was taken away as the result of a report you made, these reports are very thorough with the background of the family, with the conditions, there's, so far with the reports that's read, there's really a lot of pieces that they are looking at before ultimately making the decision to remove, because they know and they understand that there is trauma with removal, and to not take that lightly.
Thank you. That was really helpful. Mike, glad you came back. But let's just go real quick back to that question we had for Mike, which was, how does this now I'm even thinking about reporting too, but reporting and abuse in the church context. What were you going to say there?
So a couple of things. One is, as in any community, but in a Christian community, obviously we would have a higher standard for behavior than simply what is a crime. So we would have a higher standard for how children are treated. And really it's more, we want to look at it positively. How do we need to treat children to help them feel valued and give them dignity and empowerment and help them thrive? And so we want to not only say, what's the bare minimum, we have to treat them, it's what's the positive. And so as Christians, we would obviously go well beyond, the minimal definitions of what is abusive, and be aware of what our state requires. However, we want to go past that. And then in terms of spiritual abuse, just a few words about that. So in almost no states whatsoever is there going to be any kind of law related to spiritual abuse. However, that doesn't mean it's not prevalent and damaging. And so spiritual abuse is, it's often connected to other forms of abuse. So in any kind of abuse in a religious environment, there's going to be some spiritual component. So often spiritual abuse is a form of emotional abuse. So it's like a pattern of behavior using religion, religious ideas, teachings, traditions to control or manipulate or shame or degrade. And so it's just a quick definition would be abuse administered in the name of religion. And so anytime in a religious context or a religious leader is manipulating, controlling, emotionally, or of course, if there's any kind of physical, sexual abuse by a leader, there's going to be a spiritual component to that. And so, other examples would be invoking divine authority to manipulate a child. If you tell a child, God says this, that is really, really impactful on most children. And you can use that in powerfully, sadly, destructive ways to manipulate and steer children. So we have to be careful in religious environments, how we're using God, how we're using the Bible or other religious texts or our theology. And are we using them to help and empower and dignify children? Or are we using them in a way to take away their value, undermine their value, their agency, their dignity? So that's kind of a snapshot of what spiritual abuse often looks like.
Thank you, Mike. One thing I've appreciated in working with Grace, kind of this was more to your first point, is you've really helped us see, like, you kind of were talking about this maybe higher standard of, so then when we're thinking about what are our boundaries, right? We don't want our boundaries to be the law. We want to put boundaries outside of the law. So that's why we do things like we don't want kids sitting on laps, right? We don't want one kid with one adult in a room by themselves and things like that, right? We're trying to keep the boundaries farther than just like what the minimum of the law requires. And it's kind of that idea of like, we want to be above reproach, right? We want to be, that idea. So yeah, thanks, Mike, for sharing that. We did get a question on this that on the YouTube video. I thought maybe we could talk about it. It's kind of related to reporting. Somebody asked, in reports of child abuse, when is it appropriate to empower the parents to make changes themselves? Something that would maybe be in contrast with removing the children, maybe. The question is, when is it appropriate to empower parents to make changes themselves, and how do we do that well? So I don't know if that's a particular question I want to take.
If they mean instead of reporting, if abuse has already occurred, it's something that's still mandated to report. So if, the child has told, a therapist, a doctor, a church leader, that would still need to be reported. I have worked with many families where we give the option, I can make the call myself, you can make the call, but you're doing it together. Or you can make the call on your own, but I'm going to follow up and make sure that you've made the call. And I think families can feel empowered that way. Dr. Choquette mentioned, that one of the goals is to help the families access additional services. And so it's not just the removal, but sometimes I know I've made reports where a family was extremely remorseful. They knew what they'd done was wrong. But it helped to get them additional parenting skills, parenting tools, so that, the child was not at further risk. I don't know if that fully answered your question, but.
Yeah, I think that's what I understood from the question, but yeah, please go ahead, Tom.
Thank you very much. I would just like to say one other thing. Most of the cases that are opened by Child Protective Services do not result in a child going into foster care. The goal is to keep the child safely in that home. And so the work that's done with the parent is all about preventing placement. I can tell you when kids are removed, when the parents are unable or unwilling to protect their child. And Montgomery County does a very, very good job of giving parents every opportunity to make the changes that need to be made. I just wanted to point that out.
Great, thank you. Thinking more then about abuse, we kind of have talk a little bit about maybe what abuse looks like, or trying to define it a little bit. What would you say then are some of the significant medical, emotional, and psychological impacts that abuse and trauma has on children? That would be a question really for anyone here. But when we're talking about what abuse does to a child, what trauma does to a child, what is that? What does that impact look like on their lives?
That's really age dependent. If you take preschoolers, they may regress in their developmental milestones. If you take a toddler, a 3-year-old, 4-year-old who may have been toilet trained already, they'll go back to bedwetting, or have temper tantrums, and there's been a change and a regression of development. And as you go on to school-age children, they may exhibit specific stranger anxiety or anxiety to a particular person, or they won't do well in school, have bad dreams, and they may somaticize. I have belly aches, I have a headache, I don't want to go to a particular place. They can be withdrawn as well, and their social skills may be reversed too, because these children are functioning under the umbrella of being threatened. Most children, 99% of kids are threatened not to tell anybody about the abuse of what's happening in their house, and threatened in all sorts of horrific ways. If you tell, we're going to lose our house. If you tell, we're not going to have any money for food this month, because the provider may get into trouble, and we won't have anybody, we'll be homeless. And the threats go on. And even if there's no verbal threat, there's the nonverbal threat to the child, that they have to be good and compliant. And that has a big impact. And Renee, I'm sure you can speak much more eloquently to that than I am right now. Teenagers, again, that's a whole different bag. The definition of adolescence is what was normal is now abnormal, and vice versa. But you see other kinds of behaviors, more daring, risk-taking behaviors. And that they don't have to, but they do engage in substance abuse, hypersexuality, poor school performance, gang-related activities in order to be accepted, or the opposite. They can go to the extreme of being a straight A+ student in order to be good, so they won't get into trouble anymore. So it's age dependent, as well as individual response to the type of abuse and unfortunately the severity of abuse.
You did a nice job, Dr. Shuken. I mean, other things that I would mention, I think it is a really good point to say how age dependent it is. You'll also see, younger kids will often play things related to abuse that they've experienced. If you see a child, drawing, something that doesn't look appropriate, or why does this 5-year-old know something that seems a little sexually mature, those can be, signs or things that you see. Sometimes kids will act out, like with their toys, different things related to abuse. You'll see, with older kids and with teenagers, more depression. Dr. Shuket mentioned the withdrawal, kind of staying to themselves, having, kind of an outlook of things will never get better. Lots of kids blame themselves, so either they've been told it's their fault or they assume it's their fault. But there's just so much self-blame and shame and just so many complicated emotions, because if it's more often, that it's someone the child knows as opposed to a stranger. And so if it's someone that you love, you can still love the abuser, and that can be very confusing. You can be angry at the abuser, and that can be confusing. Abuse also puts, kids and teens at higher risk of suicide. And that's something to take really seriously. If a child tells somebody they're having thoughts of suicide, we need to pay attention, we need to listen and to believe them. Even if they're younger, sometimes kids can hurt themselves by accident, not realizing the finality of death, not realizing how they could hurt themselves. And I think just in general, if a child says they've experienced abuse, that it's really important to believe them. I think Dr. Choquette mentioned earlier that sometimes families will say, well, it wasn't that bad. Or I honestly had a family I was working with say, well, it happened to me and I got over it. And it's just, it impacts every child differently, but it obviously is horrific. And so it's just something that if a child says that, we need to believe them and take it very seriously and to let somebody know.
I just would like to reemphasize what Renee said. I'd say almost every child that whom Andrea and I see blame themselves, and they don't understand why it's not their fault that this happened to them. Because when you're a child, adults know everything. You have to follow adults' rules. They must be right. So what happens to them, the abuse, it clearly isn't the adult's fault. It's not the father's fault, not the mother's fault, not the aunt or the uncle or the grandparents' fault. It's your fault, the child's fault. And that is heartbreaking to hear over and over and over again. And thankfully, we have Renee and her team to help the kids work through this. We try to open that conversation up during the medical exam. To give examples how they're not responsible for other people's actions. And depending on the age of the child and the example that's presented to them, they get it, but they certainly need much more help than what we offer them. And the cognitive behavioral therapy does that.
I think building off one more time what Dr. Choquette said, you will have lots of, kids and teens say, well, if only I'd have done this, it wouldn't have happened. Or I should have known that it was weird to be alone with that person. And why should a kid know that? We definitely teach kids about, their bodies, and it's important to talk about sex and bodies and, okay touches and not okay touches. But we always let kids know it's never their fault. It's always the other person's fault, right?
Yeah, thank you for stressing that, both of you, in your responses. Want to just ask Mike if he wants to add on anything about spiritual impact on kids in a church or religious context.
Yeah, and all of that's wonderful. I would just add, in a Christian environment, when you have abuse, often victims they have a real loss of a sense of safety in church. Imagine growing up in church, and this is a place where you feel welcomed at home. And this is a place where you're valued and loved, and all of a sudden now it's connected to a horrible, maybe the most horrific experience of your life, and that can be stolen away, and that can take a lot of time if it ever is restored. So we know so many survivors in our work over the years where they're not safe in church. They don't feel safe in church, and it's important not to push people back to that before they're ready. And so we need to remember that those places can be triggering. So let's say you're a pastor, a religious leader. If you know someone's a survivor, if they've opened and trusted you with that story, maybe just ask them, is there anything I can do to make this place as safe as possible for you, and give you that and work on that sense of safety. In addition to that, there's, of course, just normal feelings of betrayal, perhaps by God or the church or spiritual leaders, feeling distant from God, and just other confusion, being confused about spirituality. Many children are raised in the church and are never, the distinction that the Treehouse folks were mentioning, of who's to blame and who's at fault. Many children just grow up hearing in church about sin, and oh, this is a sin, and I was involved in a sin, and they think of that abuse as part of something that they're involved with, as a sin that they're involved with. And so for religious leaders, the religious community to say, there's a very important distinction between sinning and being the victim of a sin, and being a sinner, and we all fall short, and still someone violating you and abusing you, and that's very different, and you're not at fault for that in any way. So there's a need for spiritual intelligence on these issues for leaders especially, and others who are supporting survivors in religious communities, to understand the deep attack this is on the dignity and identity and worth of the victim, and that's often connected to their spirituality. So in the abuse, they're lied to. You're worthless, you're disposable. And often there are spiritual tools that can be deployed, that have to be deployed in a sensitive way, in a careful way, when the survivor is ready, when they want to talk about it and not before. For them to hear from a religious leader, that was not your fault. And in fact, that this was done to you in no way says anything about God's love for you. We have to be careful that we're not triggering them in that conversation, or pushing that conversation on them. And so we have to have those tools in our skill set as pastors, to be able to pastor people and help them when those wounds have been, using the tools of spirituality, using the tools of religion to understand the harm, to understand the lies, and try to work against that.
Right. And in speaking to that, I think sometimes there's a challenge with families to explain to them that forgiveness still many times comes with consequences. So it's okay if you want to forgive, but that does not mean that legal consequences aren't going to be a part of what happens with an abuser. So sometimes with Christian families, or when there's a strong spiritual belief, they just want to forgive and to forget, but consequences do come into place, but you can still forgive and free yourself from that bondage.
Right. So forgiveness is one of the most powerful ways victims are manipulated and are continued to be manipulated and abused after the initial abuse occurs. And churches need to understand that is a brilliant point, that you can, when someone is using forgiveness immediately after abuse, they're trying to manipulate you. An abuser or their allies are bringing it up to manipulate you to avoid consequences. And that's never okay, and it further compounds the damage that's being done. Churches need to learn about those tactics. They need to learn about victim blaming. They need to learn how we can spiritualize and in using spirituality, minimize abuse. Well, I can't wait to see how God will use this in your life. That's not the right thing to say to a victim. That's going to do further damage. Or this is going to prepare you to help others. Or God doesn't give us more than we can handle. That's not what is needed in the wake of abuse. Those are further, those do further damage. So churches need to learn more about those common pitfalls. And I wish we had more time to go on, but I'll stop there, Ben. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I just want to kind of wrap up some of this and just say, as someone who I recognize that I have a certain amount of authority, a certain amount of power that comes with that, right? And as I've been trying to learn more about abuse and issues surrounding abuse, working with Grace and then other resources, learning from other experts in the field, for the best that I can, just understanding what might be triggering, right, to a victim of abuse. So for example, like a really simple example would be anytime if I'm teaching or preaching on the love of God as your heavenly Father, right? God loves you as a like that could be the most triggering thing to someone if their context of father is abuse, right? And so having to understand that in communication, and then if someone comes forward, how do I interact with that individual? And so it's just been so important and so incredibly useful to get some basic tools, understanding how to navigate that conversation, navigate how to communicate well in the role that I have. Another thing that I'll add, I love that little point there about forgiveness. And Mike, you had I think a great illustration once when you came to our church, and you used the illustration of a car crash, right? And so two things I think from that illustration. Number one was, if you get in a car crash and the person who caused the car crash, right? If the, ambulance and everything shows up and the person who caused the car crash makes it all about them and not about the victim, then you know that true repentance isn't really happening there, right? Because they're trying to keep the attention on them. And in the same thing, in an abuse context, we know that an abuser is not really looking for forgiveness and is not really repenting if all the attention and focus is on them and not on the good of the victim, right? And so I think that was like a really significant. But then another thing that with that was, oh gosh, I think I lost my point now. That you would never in that context like rush the driver who caused the accident and the victim to like reconcile right there, right? You get the victim the help they need and out of that situation, right? And so like forcing that forgiveness dynamic when it's not the time to be talking
Deal with
about
the trauma first.
Yeah, that's just been so helpful to think
and what they need. And you let any talk of forgiveness come at the pace of the victim and down the road. You don't ever try to push that. Yeah, absolutely. That's so key in Christian environments.
Well, thank you all for what you contributed on that. Let me see if there's any questions somebody typed in. We got a couple, it looks like. So I do want to get to a couple of the questions that are being put in the YouTube window. Maybe just a couple more questions that we can get to, and then we can look at the YouTube window as we close. I wonder, let's combine a couple questions. So number one is, I know this is probably, again, it's so many possible answers here, right? But are there any particular issues, circumstances, situations, or dynamics which we see especially happening in Montgomery County that lead to abuse? And so is there anything unique about our area that you see as a common thread maybe in abuse cases? Or are there any, I know that's probably hard because I know every situation is so different, but is there anything you can say about what it looks like to care for victims in Montgomery County specifically? And then in addition to that, what might be obstacles for reporting and responding to abuse, which again might be Montgomery County specific? Like, what are some obstacles that victims or their families might face in the reporting and responding process? So I hope those questions
I will say that living in a more affluent county, we do have some private funds, but a lot of what we need comes from the public. But when the public doesn't want to accept that they have this problem in their community, it's hard for them to be honest enough to give to support children who have been victims because they don't want to admit that it's a problem. So I think that for me in Montgomery County, I think that being more affluent actually has sometimes worked against us because people just don't believe that it's happening in our community.
Go
ahead, Evelyn.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think one of the obstacles to reporting is that this area has a population that is undocumented, and people are afraid that if they do report, it may negatively impact on their living status here, which it does not. Child abuse and citizenship and country of origin do not equate. When you report a child who's been abused, nobody's asking you if you're documented or not documented. That has been a barrier for some families. I think the types of abuse in Montgomery County is representative of the abuse across the country and the world. What we see everything here, all manifestations of horror and abuse and neglect. Andrea, I don't think this area is particularly specific to one or two types of this. And Andrea is correct. People don't want to know that abuse happens, but you know, there's these nasty statistics that say that 1 out of every 4 females by the time of 18 years of age has been suffering some sort of sexual abuse. We don't know the statistics about boys particularly. It used to be 1 out of 10, now 1 out of 6, because boys don't talk too much about their type of their sexual abuse for different psychosocial reasons. And neglect is pervasive and the most common form of child abuse. So I don't think there's just one form that sticks out in this zip code. That's an equal opportunity abuser. Tom.
2 things. I was going to say what Evelyn did. We've had cases of people that make lots and lots of money, and we've had part-time bus drivers and Uber drivers, and all of them are alleged perpetrators of sex abuse. It is so cross-cutting, and everyone in Montgomery County and the nation believes it happens in that other neighborhood, not mine. And we're no different than any other place in America.
That's right.
Secondly, I want to say that the pandemic has really scared me. And it is an obstacle to protecting kids because we don't know who's seeing these children other than their abuser. And the cases that are coming forward during the pandemic are the worst of the worst. But there are still kids suffering every day because they're not visible to a caring person who would call it in. And I hope we get past this so that kids can have a routine and get back in front of helping professionals who can make the call and do something.
You know, I have friends who are teachers or who have children who are teachers. And the one thing, if we could tell families, is to teach their children a safe word, that when that child uses that special word, that's an indicator to a non-offending parent that this kid is in trouble. So they know what to look for or to protect. Sometimes the child just can't say what's happening to them. They're afraid. Many times they are, but if they use that magic word, that will alert a family member to help protect the child or at least look into a situation.
I was going to mention another barrier to reporting abuse, discomfort in talking about sexuality and talking about sex. You know, kids not, you know, being taught the proper names for their private parts. Like those are things that sometimes there's discomfort around that, but it's really a protective factor, you know, for kids. If they can say, they know the names of their private parts and they can say someone touched that versus someone touched a made up name, right, for their private parts, you know, that's something that's a really big protective factor. And, you know, letting kids know that you can talk about these things, that it's not shameful, you know, giving them facts and information around sex at an age appropriate level, you know, but giving them that information is another big protective factor.
I think one of the biggest things that we probably didn't mention is that we are in an affluent county. We understand that, but services for everyone are free of charge, documented or undocumented. It doesn't matter. So I just want to make sure that the community knows that as well.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good point, and I meant to make that earlier. So thanks for mentioning that, Andrea. Tom, you mentioned the pandemic, COVID-19. That is one of the questions we wanted to talk about. And so maybe in addition to, Tom, what you mentioned, just that kids who are being abused aren't seeing anyone other than their abuser. And my guess is a lot of reporting would come from schools or teachers, or maybe a significant amount. So they're not having that now. In addition to that, or if you want to talk about that more, what are some of the challenges that have been for you all during this pandemic?
Once again, I'm going to let my crack staff chime in as well. But I can tell you that we have stayed in touch with all of the kids who need our care. during this pandemic. We have moved rapidly to telehealth and telemental health. And so all of the kids who need to see a professional are seeing a professional at the treehouse. Maybe not physically, but certainly there's regular contact. And that's really good. We do have the capacity to serve more kids, and we're about to open up the building again and get in there on a regular basis. And I'm excited about that. But those folks who are seeing children, be it in social settings or in the public, anywhere, that they have concerns about it, they need to let us know, professionals like Child Protective Service, because those kids are out there and we know that they need our help. So anybody else, feel free to pipe up.
I think it goes back to the question that was posed earlier about giving families a chance. You know, when we don't have children going to school or many other places in the public, their chance may be the neighbor or someone else in the family who knows what's going on. So, you know, never discount your importance in having change happen, you know, in that child's life and reporting.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Ben, I just a couple thoughts
Yeah.
if I could add.
Sure.
You know, in addition, your research tells us that most cases of abuse of really any kind, a lot of it's happening at home, if not most of it, right? So spending more time at home is often spending more time in close contact with those who are abusive. So whether it's a sibling, a parent, or a neighbor in the home, that's just more time. We just need to shift our mentality. I've had several churches since the pandemic began tell me, well, at least we don't have to worry about child abuse now during the pandemic because the children aren't in our church buildings and on our property. And I say, look, no, wrong mentality. That's the risk management mentality that churches need to get away from. Just because they're not on your property and not in your building, it doesn't mean the abuse isn't happening. It doesn't mean it's not your responsibility on some level. And so you as a church can listen carefully when you're checking in on Zoom, when you're socially distancing, in listening to what's happening in the background and how the children are being talked to. Is there yelling in the background? Those sorts of things you just need to pay close attention to. And you need to look for those signs, and you have to have education and know what to do. And of course, children are online more than ever now. And so much exploitation is happening in online formats. And so we just have to be really careful in all of those areas, and churches can help parents with resources and knowledge on those issues. And we have to understand that children, it's already been mentioned, disclose abuse in ways that are counterintuitive to us as adults sometimes. So we've already mentioned non-disclosure is normal. And so unconvincing disclosure is normal, or reluctant disclosure. So if a child just says to you when you ask and check in with someone from your church, oh yeah, I'm having a really hard time right now. Well, you don't jump to conclusions and assume they're being abused, but you do just ask an open-ended question and say, you know, I'm really sorry to hear that. Can you tell me more about that? And just create space. And with that relationship and with trust built, there are times where children will begin to open up and speak to what they're dealing with. And so we have to, as adults, take responsibility to work hard to create those spaces, to work on that trust, and realize often what children are up against. If they're being abused by someone often more powerful and who's threatening them, that's a big step to make themselves vulnerable again to another adult who's more powerful. And so to recognize when they overcome that and say something, for us to be able to meet them with, I'm so sorry, I believe you, and I'm going to help you and do whatever I can. That's a powerful moment.
I think that's really important what Mike said. You know, once a child discloses, it's so brave, you know, to share, to make sure that we're not asking questions like, why didn't you tell me sooner? Why didn't you stop it? Why didn't you walk away? Because it's such a scary and a hard thing to disclose. A lot of people never tell about their abuse. It's very, very common to wait months and years to report abuse. So once somebody reports exactly the things that you said, thank you for telling me, we're going to help.
When I talk to my colleagues and social workers, therapists, and everybody at the Treehouse, I try to reinforce to everybody that the disclosure of abuse by a child is like peeling an onion. You get layer by layer by layer until you get to the core when that child feels comfortable. I can't tell you how often kids will tell me in my office that once they do fully disclose, even after being forensically interviewed, that they feel so much better, that a burden has been lifted from their shoulders, but the aftermath still remains. So it takes months, years, and as Renee said, there are people who never disclose. I meet adults all the time who, after learning what I do for a living, will say, well, when I was 8 years old, I had a neighbor that took me into a closet and I never told anyone. That's not uncommon, and that's sad.
Yeah, and if we had more time, wanting to respect everybody's time, that was one thing I did want to talk about, was sort of that long-term impact on adults, sort of on undisclosed, untreated abuse in adults. And a lot could be said there, but I want to be sensitive to time.
Well, there's something very quickly called the ACE criteria, adverse childhood events. And there was a study in the 90s that followed adults who were abused by children. And there's an increase in cancer, psychiatric problems, heart disease, diabetes, hypertension, a whole slew of things that are positively associated with the history of childhood abuse. So it is important that we deal with it now in order to avoid the long-term, not only personal benefits, but also monetary and economic problems that follow.
Yeah, I was going to mention, I had read The Body Keeps the Score, and Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, is that correct? But I remember him making the point in that book that this, with all of the issues that adults who had suffered abuse and trauma end up suffering from in adulthood, if we could then get rid of abuse and trauma, it would be, the most cost-effective thing we could do for our healthcare system, because of all of the ways it affects adults, with everything you just mentioned, with cancer, hypertension, so on, diabetes, just all the incredible, sadly tragic ways it affects adults. So I wanted to ask, hopefully we have enough time for this. Is everyone okay on time for just a couple more questions? And there was a couple questions from YouTube, and then I wanted to give a chance to plug how to connect with each organization. But again, here's two more questions that are sort of connected. Would be, how can support communities, which could be range from a family to a church or some other group, right? So how can communities support victims of abuse, right? So maybe getting to, how can regular people become equipped to be aware and support in some way? So how can communities support victims of abuse? And then how can communities make issues surrounding abuse, whether it's reporting or just being present, how can they make it worse, right? So how can communities help, basically, and how can they make it worse? Whoever wants to answer either of those.
I'll start and just talk about churches a little bit. And I think a lot of this would apply to other organizations as well. Leaders need to recognize you have to speak up. You have to talk about this issue. You have to name it. You have a responsibility to bring people out of denial and educate them. And so you have to, and I would say specifically to religious leaders, you have to show your people. This is not just an issue of 2020 and the Me Too movement. This is something your faith tradition addresses. So I would tell pastors, Jesus spoke about wolves in sheep's clothing. There is no excuse for you not to talk about deception and secrecy and predatory behavior. That's exactly what he was talking about 2,000 years ago. Your people have to see you speaking about these issues, applying your faith tradition to these issues. If you want a faith community to take this seriously, you have to show that this is relevant to their faith and to their particular faith tradition. There are powerful ways to do this. So you have to do that. You have to then, secondly, I would say, make sure there's proactive policies and training that engages all within the community in prevention and response. You can't just say, okay, children's director, you take care of our abuse, you take care of preventing abuse. That's not how abuse works. You can't only focus on the structured times with the children. It's going to happen, the grooming and the abuse, it happens in the hallway and in the bathroom and in the parking lot before and after church. And of course, as we said, beyond the church property. Everyone has to be engaged on some level. And in particular, the adults have to bear responsibility. Children, it's vital that we educate them, but even children who are educated cannot often prevent the abuse from occurring, even when they do disclose. And like was said, boys disclose much less frequently than girls. We're often only responding to it after the fact. To do actual prevention, we have to get all the adults and build a culture where prevention and response can occur. And you have to address cultural issues like holding each other accountable, and cultural questions like, oh, well, if we're saying that we need to have these practices in place, is our community a safe place? Or are we saying, do we have to treat everyone with suspicion? Well, that's a very important question for leaders to work through with the community and address, and say within these boundaries, when we have clear boundaries, we can build trust and we don't have to be suspicious every moment. So those are organizational things. And then personally, of course, helping everyone get basic skills of what to say to abuse disclosure. I believe you. I'm so sorry. I'm here to help. This is not your fault. And to learn more about trauma and to know your limits with trauma. So like you're doing here, we need to bring in the treehouse and know that I was a pastor for many years before I do this work with Grace full time. Now, I had to know my limits as a pastor. I'm not a trauma therapist. And so I play a critical role in support, and I can be trauma sensitive, but I'm not a professional. And I have to respect the role of professionals in this area. And it's nothing against my ability to counsel as a pastor to recognize my limits. That's just wise. So we have to bring that together and learn. In Christian communities, there has to be a partnership of relying upon professionals and getting access to professionals with trauma therapy and treatment. At the same time, pastors cannot shrink back from supporting trauma victims and trauma survivors, and to help give them space to create a narrative without judging them, that they're not to blame, to give them agency, and to give them space to express hard emotions and lament what has happened, and give voice to the anger and the confusion. That's all very healthy and necessary for healing. And so churches and just any supportive community can play a massive, hugely important role in that healing while partnering with trauma-informed professionals. So that's a few key thoughts, I think.
I think building off of what Mike said, when somebody makes a disclosure, other people are paying attention, so seeing that whatever agency they report to, whether it's to a church, to a school, to, or just to a family, to know that someone takes it seriously, that's going to impact other people feeling comfortable to disclose. So if you had a church member disclose to you, other people seeing that was taken seriously, that person wasn't blamed, they were believed, they were accepted. A lot of people worry about being shamed and ostracized after they disclose. So knowing that they continue to be loved and to be cared for, that's going to be important. I think having the conversations like you're having now, just seeing that you're raising awareness, we can't wait for people to come to us and to say abuse happened, because we know how difficult that is. But having those conversations, giving those opportunities. I've had multiple teenagers or younger disclose after they went to health class and said, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that was abuse. So I think schools are doing a better job of talking about these things, talking about that this might be a step away from abuse, but that this can happen in dating situations and things like that too, that, you know, just giving that education, teaching kids, you know, assertiveness. Again, it's never a kid's job, I think someone else said, to stop abuse, but just knowing that if you don't want to hug grandpa, you don't have to. If you don't want to sit on Uncle so-and-so's lap, you don't have to. I think it starts so young, you know, teaching kids how to be strong. They're in charge of their bodies are theirs. We can't wait for people to get to high school to say, well, you should have known to say no, right? It's something that the practicing those, you know, skills, you know, starts so young.
What Renee said is absolutely right on point. We see a lot of kids who are in 5th grade when they have health class. So they're 10 years of age. Put the name of abuse to what's been happening to their bodies. They didn't know what to call it. And all of a sudden they know, oh, this wasn't right. I knew it wasn't right, but I'm being abused. And they start telling their teachers and counselors. The same token, we have to, as pediatricians and healthcare providers, we have to do a better job teaching parents how to teach children to be safe with their own bodies from a young age, and to explain how to keep an open dialogue between the child and the parent. If something's bothering the child, that they won't get in trouble, and that the parent is there to help and protect them, and that they will always be believed.
And if I can add, Ben, a simple answer to what does a community do to make this worse or to keep it going? Do what we've always been doing. Look at the situations with the Olympic Committee and with the Penn State University and with Michigan State, and believe that it's happening somewhere else and not in your community. And if that's the way you're going to live with childhood sex abuse for a very, very long time. So I would ask people to think differently and to be mindful that if a kid says they're scared, there's a legitimate reason for that. I just thought I'd add that to the chat.
Yeah, that's a great point, Tom. I was reflecting on this a little bit as I was thinking about promoting this webinar. You know, this would be my word to other pastors or other people in other churches who may be tuning in, but you know, the Gospels talk about how Jesus looked on the crowds and had compassion because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. And so the question I would just pose to folks from churches, pastors or not, do you have compassion when you look on crowds? And are you willing to look at groups of people as seeing that there are abuses and harassments happening within, like, right here, you know? And are you gonna move to compassion, or are you gonna be in denial, or you know, whatever the case may be? So I think that's a really important point. Well, let me do a couple quick questions from YouTube, and then we'll close out just by kind of how we can get in touch with the Treehouse, or any closing comments that you all may have. One quick question. I'm not sure what this acronym stands for, so hopefully one of you can explain this, but someone asked, what percentage of referrals end up in CINA hearings? Anyone care to take that?
I can handle that because I think I'm the one that has way too many years in the business. CINA is Child in Need of Assistance. It is a finding that occurs in family court throughout the state of Maryland. And I was alluding to that in an earlier answer. Most of the cases that are reported, the real effort is made with the parent to keep the family together. And in Montgomery County, which has 1.1 million people, there are 400 kids in foster care. Now that's sad, that's 400 kids, but it's relatively speaking a low number. And that's because our county does work very hard to keep families together. And when a CINA hearing occurs, it's because the parent has been unable or unwilling to protect the child themselves. So I don't have an actual percentage for you, but I can guarantee you that our county does a wonderful job of not putting kids in foster care, and the kids who go in need to be there.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tom.
Sure.
This question would kind of be for anyone, but maybe I want to ask it first to some of you on the call who haven't maybe been able to speak as much. So I'm thinking Linda, Sarah, and Rebecca. This is just a general question. How did you end up in this doing what you do? What maybe led you either to the Treehouse specifically, or what, wanting to help kids and families? So maybe if one of you three want to respond, and then maybe a couple others would want to take that question.
Yeah, I'll go first. So what drew me to the Treehouse would definitely be the Treehouse mission, and to be able to assist children behind the scenes, even though I'm not in the professional services, medical or mental health, but to be able to use my skills through communications, through social media marketing, to help the children and to see that growth. We offer children different resources, such as back to school book bags, school supplies, coats in the winter, snacks, and just to see children being able to walk out with those items and with smiles on their faces, definitely, makes the world for me, and, makes the job worth it.
I think I've always had a desire to work with kids, especially kids that need a little bit of extra help. Children are the most vulnerable population we have out there. And I think the Treehouse does a great job of serving them. And I think the fact that we are a child advocacy center and we provide all of these services free of charge for all of these kids to whoever needs it, I think was a big draw for me to join the Treehouse. And it's been a rewarding time just being able to help the kids that we help, and knowing that even if we just do a little bit, we've done a little bit more to help them to heal.
And I would say that what drew me to the Treehouse and just working with childhood trauma was honestly some of what we've touched on during this time, just how there is, ways that that people can respond that are harmful, and ways that can be helpful. And, seeing some of those ways that trauma had been responded to um, in my own life, I really was looking at that and seeing, wow, a lot of people causing harm and responding the wrong way, even faith communities, as you all have talked about, is partly due from lack of knowledge about how to really respond and be helpful and be supportive. And so just realizing that, through continuing to advocate for children and for people who have experienced trauma, that the impacts don't have to be as severe, and the responses of the community can be helpful rather than hurtful.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe one or two others would want to respond, how they ended up in their line of work,
Sure.
what drew them.
I'm happy to. Just like Rebecca, I was drawn by the mission at the Treehouse too. I have worked in other clinics where people I couldn't afford to see myself, to be honest, other places I've worked. And I just really appreciate that, that we can connect people to services, that does not have to be a barrier. During COVID, Rebecca sends emails saying, does anybody need, support? Families need food, money for groceries. And I can say yes, and a family gets support. I also really, really appreciate that the treatment that we do works. It's not a guarantee, it's not a promise for everyone, but it's really effective. It really helps kids to get better. I think sometimes people have the misconception that this is damaging forever and you can't recover. But that's just not at all true. I've had families say like, wow, I have my kid back, after doing the treatment that we do. And people sometimes will say, like, how can you do that work and talk to kids who've experienced abuse all day? And I love it. I mean, these kids get better. And, I've had a kid where our first meeting was underneath the table in the hospital. And by the end, they're just the family who said, I have my kid back. So, that's really rewarding. It makes a big difference.
And for me, I'm actually on the opposite side of the table from everyone who said that they chose to work at the treehouse. I worked as a nurse in the county for over 20 years. And if you know about county government, where there's a need, they will send you. So I was sent to the treehouse and I did not want to go. And now that I've been there, I mean, I got there and I'm like, oh my gosh, like, this is the most rewarding position that I've had in my career. And remember, I told you I've been with the county over 20 years. So that says a lot. I actually feel like I'm one of the people who are blessed and get paid simply to operate in their purpose. I mean, how can you beat that? So I get paid to do what I feel like I was born to do on this earth. And I absolutely love it. The children are resilient. Their little spirits inspire me daily. They make me a better person.
It's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. I just want to close with an opportunity for anyone watching this to know how they can get connected with either the Treehouse or Grace. And one thing, maybe just saying before this, I kind of want, for my own benefit, I wanted to know about how to find child advocacy centers. And so if anyone's watching this, like not in Montgomery County, there's a couple national organizations that look like you can get connected with that break down child advocacy centers by state. I'm not remembering off the top of my head. One of you might know, but if you just do a quick Google search for child advocacy.
The National Children's Alliance.
Yeah.
And that will have all the CACs in the state.
Yeah. So that would be just a way to get connected if you're not in Montgomery County, a way to get connected with a CAC near you. So maybe this would be like for Rebecca, your communications and community director. So how would someone get connected with the Treehouse? And this would, I know it's a second part question, but I think it's important for people to know about how important your work is and how why supporting a CAC like Treehouse is so significant. So maybe this isn't Rebecca, but another one for someone else first. How many kids do you see a year? How many kids are you able to see a year? And then thinking about that in terms of what like the total need probably in Montgomery County is. Right. So how many kids are you able to see a year? And then we know, like, based on the 1 in 4 figures and everything, kind of then thinking about Montgomery County more broadly. So anyone want to take that, Rebecca or someone else?
So I don't know if Rebecca knows, so I'm going to answer it for her. And it's not because she shouldn't know, it's just because she doesn't do the clinical work.
Yeah.
We average about 2 new cases a day. Okay. And that has been relatively consistent since I arrived there in 2011. We anticipated getting to be more based on some changes that are occurring within county government. So our capacity is limited for therapy, but not limited for the medical side or the forensics or our person who helps them in court. We're going to work to increase our capacity to serve every child who is referred to us. But it's a busy little shop when you consider 2 new cases a day, and kids can be in therapy for as long as 6 months, and the court process can take up to 1.5 years, 2 years.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess just thinking about that in light of, okay, so someone had said earlier, Montgomery County is 1.1 million. So how much of that is children? 300, 400,000, right?
Roughly.
Talking the 1 in 4 number. So, I mean, just, it breaks my heart to know that even as much work as you're able to do, how many other kids are out there not able to get the help they need. And so I just wanted to say that briefly when we're talking about getting connected with the Treehouse or another CAC, like the work is so significant. So Rebecca, how can someone get connected with the Treehouse, either for support or maybe for care?
Yeah. So if you're looking for support or care, a good way to get connected with the Treehouse or to look for resources is our website. And our brand new website is going to be live very soon, hopefully within this month or into the next. And if you just Google treehousemd.org, it'll pop up. We have tons of resources for child abuse, for resources for parents, children, teens. And it's a great way to get in contact if you're looking for support. You can shoot us an email at contact@treehousemd.com and send your questions or inquiries there, and you can get in contact with us that way. Another way to get involved with the Treehouse is to follow us on our social media platforms. We post daily our current needs. If you're looking to donate to the Treehouse, or you're looking just to get involved, following us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, just Treehouse MD, you'll find us and we post daily. We have our fundraising event in the spring. Unfortunately, due to COVID-19, this past spring event had to be canceled, but we hope to be back spring 2021, and that is the Treehouse Tour to Cookie. It's a large bike ride throughout Montgomery County, and it's one of our largest fundraisers. We hope to start promoting it soon. And again, that is one of the biggest ways to get involved with the Treehouse.
Thanks, Rebecca. And I'll just add, one thing I appreciated when I first met Rebecca, to kind of talk through the potential of our church supporting Treehouse. One thing you said is like kind of encouraging, if an organization wants to help in any way, Treehouse, like kind of encouraging creativity on our part, like how do we think we can help, and then kind of coming along and trying to offer that to you all. And so for us, that meant a fundraiser that we're going to plug in just a moment, but maybe it's something where they want to help meet all the food snacks that you have, right? If an organization want to come along and say we will supply your food snacks, whatever. I know other people have gotten really creative and backpack drives and coat drives and stuff for you all. So if you're watching this, you're in Montgomery County, want to know how to support, like help Treehouse, I encourage you just to get creative and get in touch with Rebecca at the Treehouse. So then let's turn to Mike here. Mike, how can churches or individuals get in touch with Grace, or how could they support the work of Grace?
Sure, thanks, Ben. The easiest way is just to go to our website, netgrace.org. You'll see all of our resources there. You can sign up for our newsletter. You can get connected to us on social media there and learn about our services, including our Safeguarding Initiative, which is our more comprehensive approach to helping churches and other Christian organizations take significant steps forward and really focus on culture change. So I would say also at this time during the pandemic, we do offer online training. So if that's, obviously not everyone is open right now. Churches are not all meeting in person. And so we can still do training with leadership or in other formats for parents and other church members online. So on our website, you can find how to contact us, and glad to hear from you. And just want to say thank you to the Treehouse for all you're doing. It's just incredible work. And I hope more and more churches realize the value and what is absolutely vital for communities to flourish in child advocacy centers, and we'll step up and support the work you're doing. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. And anything we can do to work together with you, we are open to it. So don't hesitate to be in touch.
Absolutely, thanks.
Before we close, I just want to plug, as I mentioned, our church is doing a fundraiser right now for the Treehouse. And so if you're watching this now, or you're watching this at some point in the future, and you want to be able to support the work of the Treehouse, the best way, I can't post a link here so I could have held up a picture if I had made it ahead of time. But you can look up Shady Grove Presbyterian Church on Facebook. And I've been blasting our social media feed with links to the fundraiser. Right now, it's a shirt fundraiser, so you can buy a shirt. If you don't want to buy the shirt, you can just donate money, or you can do both. And really hoping to help out the Treehouse right now. So would love it if you're able to find that. Again, Shady Grove Presbyterian Church on Facebook. I think there's 2 Shady Grove Presbyterian churches. One's in Georgia and one's in Maryland. So make sure you're looking at the one in Maryland. And
Oh, no.
yeah, so would love it if you're watching this and if you would love to join us in supporting the Treehouse. And all donations, all money raised is going to go to the Treehouse, and that fundraiser ends July 12th. So thank you all for your time. Thank you so much. I think this was a very informative. I hope that other people will be able to watch this video in the future and be able to circulate it, and hope it'll be of great help to many people. So thank you for your time and using your evening.
A pleasure. Thank you, Ben
you.
and Sarah.
Yes.
Thank you for having us.
Enjoy the video.
All right. Thank you all. Have a good night.
Have a good
Bye.
evening.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Peace.